I can't take any credit for this wonderful occurrence. It's all Adam Yankee's doing. So I want to introduce Mayor Nomura, Wade Nomura of Carpinteria. And Adam. So we currently have an installation. This is our community classroom space. Adam currently has an installation here, which is the reason we are all together. And so I'm going to hand it over to Adam to just take it away. Thank you.
All right, y'all. Thank you everyone for being here. It's the importance of Wade and cycling is self-evident in this community. And so when me and Alex started talking about this idea for an exhibition regarding bikes, I had a number of ideas that kind of went every which way. But one of the ideas I really wanted to be a fixture of this installation was and is Wade. Wade is someone that I really wasn't familiar with until I started getting into the recesses of very kind of specific cycling culture. And the more I kind of delved into that history, the more curious I became about it. And that curiosity really became this kind of like moment of realization about Wade's importance not only to the global cycling community and its technological evolution, but also our global community as well. So Wade is kind enough to be a part of this project and be featured for this interview. And so Wade is also self-published a book, a memoir, which are all for sale on the table to my right. And I highly encourage everyone to support and pick up a copy before you leave today. But when I reached out to Wade, I just wanted to talk about bikes, and I just wanted to talk about BMX, and I wanted to talk about aluminum fabrication. And the little bit that me and Wade have been able to interface before this day, it's become quite clear that Wade's life is much more interesting and textured than just bikes. And I think that's what's really representational about this project, is that this is, yes, it's about bikes, but it's not about bikes. It's about highlighting this kind of really diverse ecology and cycling community we have in Santa Barbara. And that is, again, self-evident by kind of how Wade fits into this very specific timeline that has since influenced quite a bit. So, again, so my name is Adam, and I'll let Wade introduce himself.
Yeah, Wade Nomura, born and raised in Santa Barbara, actually. Now living in Carpinteria, moved to Carpinteria in '76, and unfortunately ended up becoming the mayor of Carpinteria. It's exactly a good thing, but it's an interesting life.
Yeah, very cool. So yeah, what we're going to do, we're going to talk for probably like 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. Cool. All right, so I have a copy of Wade's book right here. And basically, the questions that I have for Wade are really sourced from this book, but also sourced from, again, this curiosity of BMX and curiosity of cycling, but then curiosity about Wade's history. So, you want to sit down? So Wade, your book, Creating Destiny, is the title. And then you wrote on the inside to me, when you sent it to me, you said, enjoy creating your destiny. And I felt like that was intentional. The title, if you could like sign it over to people this way.
Correct. Yeah, that is correct.
Do you want to explain a little bit about the title, like where you came up with that?
I had planned on writing a book for quite a while, probably thinking about it for about 10, 12 years, and I wanted to do a biography, but the intent of the book actually was to pass this down to my children and their children, so the family would have a little history of somebody that came from this family life. However, in doing so, I probably spent about 5 minutes thinking about it, and that was about as far as it got. When COVID hit and I married my wife Debbie over there, she told me, she goes, you know what, you've got to do that book. You've got to write that book, but the idea for the book now is going to be that you want to share those experiences of life that you had. And the experiences in life that I had, the reason that the title became Creating Destiny was because for me, I had no idea where I was going to end up. I will tell you this, I never in my lifetime would have imagined ever jumping on a BMX bike. I never in my lifetime would ever thought I would be a mayor of a city. So all these things just happened. Currently, I'm also doing a lot of work for Rotary International. I do humanitarian projects and have been involved annually with as many as 1,000 projects around the world. So again, something I never planned on doing. That's why the title became Creating Destiny, because your destiny is something that just happens. And if you take advantage of those things that come along that you are passionate about, or you know you can make an impact and change somebody else's life, you would go in that direction. So what's that do? That makes your life look like a zigzag. You have no idea where you're going to go. But the end result is that you, in this zigzag motion, you've touched millions of people's lives and changed those. So I think that's why Creating Destiny became the title of this book. I thought that was one of those messages I did want to convey.
Yeah, very cool. So destiny is, I feel like, is this like pervasive theme throughout your book. And we met up for breakfast a few weeks ago, and you mentioned that your familial roots in this area go back to the late 1800s. That is incredible. Do you want to explain a little bit about how that kind of came to be?
My grandparents actually migrated here. The first one came in the 1890s. Other ones came shortly after that, in the early 1900s. So they all came from Japan. So our family roots from my grandparents' time were from Japan. What happened during that time cycle is that they became involved mostly in agriculture. They're agricultural workers, farmers, things like that. My grandfather was a melon grower in Imperial Valley. My other grandfather on my mother's side had a produce business, and so that's how they ended up making a living. The reason for it, from what I understand of them coming over here, was because the United States, America, was looked at a place of prosperity. In Japanese culture, if you are in a certain caste, a certain society, you're not going to be able to move up that ladder, not effectively. Whereas if you're here in the United States, anybody could prosper if they work hard at it. So that was the dream that they came for, was to see that happen.
Yeah. So very interesting that is, like, it's very interesting, but it's also not surprising to kind of understand that narrative from the outside looking in, but then at times when you do possess that reality, whatever that dream is, we as individuals or communities chase, it looks a little different when we do finally catch it. And so World War II comes around, and your family is rounded up and interned and forcibly displaced along with hundreds of thousands, or roughly 100,000 other Japanese families. Your family decided to locate to Santa Barbara after being released from internment. Can you talk a little bit about, if you can, share about that experience about being forcibly interned from your family's perspective, but then also how they made that conclusion to stay in the United States, but then also land in Santa Barbara?
Sure. That's an interesting one. I could talk all day on how that actually transpired. But my grandparents, my father's side, were in Imperial Valley, as I said. They were rounded up literally World War II time and taken to post in Arizona. My mother's family was in San Luis Obispo. Same thing happened to them. They were given 24 hours to pack up a bag, and that's all they could take with them. My mother talks about on that trip going to Poston, not knowing where they're going, that they were actually put in cattle cars because there weren't enough trains for them to get around. They were told that all of their possessions, including their pets, whatever they had, properties, houses, personal belongings, everything else would be taken care of. They were going to put those in warehouses. Well, of course, 4 years later, they were all gone, so that didn't happen. The fortunate part for some people, for example, my late wife's family, they actually had somebody that was willing to take care of their place for them. They left the business with this gentleman. He took care of the whole thing, and at the end of the war, he handed them back the keys and said, it's all yours. But that did not happen very often. If you look at some of the other people that were actually displaced, we have doctors, dentists, a lot of professional people. Well, their practices were taken away, and they were not able to go back and reestablish practices because their clientele were people that didn't trust them because of the war. So because of that, it was hard to find a relocation center coming back out of that time period. My parents, both sides, my mother's side and my father's side, actually ended up in Santa Barbara. My grandfather on the Nomura side was actually recruited out of camp. He was offered a job by then International Olympic President Avery Brundage to take care of his stake here in Montecito. So that's how the Nomura family ended up here. My mother's side, because it was limited on where they could go to, because they had no idea what it was going to be like back home or wherever they were coming from originally, the group actually settled into Santa Barbara because there was a strong Chinatown right near here. And in that Chinatown, they were able to then get a portion of it. 2 blocks of it was converted to Japantown, Japanese town. And so that was a safe haven for them. They could literally come in there and have a neighborhood and be able to live similar to what they did in camp, with the security knowing that they had, the numbers, something that wouldn't be isolated. Eventually, they moved out slightly beyond that. We have families I know that ended up on the Mesa, tried to farm out there, and some people in Toledo. So that's how we actually ended up in Santa Barbara, just because of the relocation process.
Yeah. When you talked about having possessions taken and not returned during a tournament, did your family, I mean, besides this business on your wife's side, were there any personal artifacts that were ever restated to your family?
Recovered?
Recovered, yeah.
Not really.
Yeah.
None that I heard of.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there were a few incidents where it actually was good. Some families were invited back to the neighborhoods. The family actually was welcomed back by certain neighborhoods, but this was a very rare occasion. If you think about it too, wartime, and for those of you that are my age or older, if you recall what happened right after the war, and if you're watching television or movies, there was no such thing as a good guy in Japanese, because it was right after the war. So Japanese were given the face of the enemy, no matter where you go. This was 10, 15 years later, those movies still existed, where the only time somebody from America would see a Japanese person was on one of those movies as a bad person, as the enemy. So it was hard to then get back into it. And I've had to deal with a lot of prejudice, especially as a younger person.
You mentioned in your book, I believe in the first chapter, that your grandfather, out of boredom, had begun like doing these carvings, these like wood sculpture carvings. And I'm curious if you still have any of those, or if you're still in possession of any of those. But I'm also curious what the link is between what your grandfather makes, or what your family makes in general, and your connection to making things and being a fabricator. And is there any lineage there? And are there other Nomuras making things?
That is a good question. Something I hadn't thought about until you mentioned that right now. My grandfather actually was, he started whittling in camp because he had nothing to do. They had, all day long, they didn't have any jobs or business, and so literally he sat around. He was able to get a whittling knife, which was very rare. He was able to get a small pocket knife in because they're illegal in the camps. And with that little knife, he started whittling by finding burrwood outside of Poston, out there in the desert. He would bring this home and actually carve things. And I do. I have actually a bookend carving of horses, which I do keep. That's one of my possessions. I was fortunate too because I'm the firstborn son of the firstborn son. So fortunately, I got to pick up what I wanted to keep from my grandfather's family. That's what I got. That was his prized possession, so that became mine. My father, late in life, did start doing the same thing. He took up carving too because his father was a wood carver. So because of that, recently, as an extreme, very recently, with the COVID time, I actually started doing a little bit of wood carving also. So it looks like it's my destiny. I didn't want to kill that destiny. I didn't want to be the one person to say, well, that was it. You know, it was a tradition until that guy showed up. So I started carving too. But when you take a look at it, when you asked me about the bike, the BMX bike, and what I did there, other things, life lessons, I will tell you this, and I'll share a story. This is one that my grandfather told me when I was very young. He would take me to the Brundage estate, and when Brundage was coming home, he would walk the grounds in Moss. And by the way, it's right next to, right behind Lotus Land. That's where the estate was. And he would walk in there, and we would walk the whole grounds before he came in. And on that one day, we were at the gate looking back, and he goes, wait, I want you to take a look and see. And I was probably only 4 or 5 years old. He goes, what do you see? I said, well, I see an immaculate garden. I says, every hedge literally was perfectly square, perfectly trimmed. There was not a leaf out of place, no weeds anywhere. Even the gravel and the soil had rake marks on it that were consistent with a pattern, a water pattern. So I said, I don't see anything you could have done there. That's about as good as it would get. I can't see it being improved. And he goes, I want you to remember that. He goes, whatever you do in life, when you do something and you're out someplace, you make sure that you leave it better than you found it. You take pride in what you do, no matter what it is, whether it's gardening, whether it's landscaping, or whatever you decide to do, or carving. He goes, you do the best you can at it, because you'll always find flaws, but you always know it was your best effort. So that was my life lesson from him. And that's where the bikes kind of came into play, because my landscaping career, I'm a landscape contractor. I've always strived to have the best possible landscape. Never do anything halfway, you make it the best. Even if it comes out of your pocket to make it better, you make it better. Well, the bike frames are exactly the same. I never thought about being a BMX racer, but once I started looking at it, and I opened up the bike shop on Alomar, I saw these bike frames coming through. And at that time, I took 12 frames that I could buy, put them all side by side, took a look at the geometries of them, and this is well before CAD or computers, and I actually drafted on paper every frame that I could buy or that I could get. And I went out and had my riders evaluate the ride of them, which one was faster, which one was quicker off the gate, which one jumped better, which one turned better. And I started finding all these trends in each bike design. For example, the rear triangle, where the change is at, shorter was faster, shorter was better. On the front, longer was better because you have more leverage. Height-wise, I found in part of my design of the bikes and why a lot of people had a hard time learning how to ride them, I dropped the bottom bracket, or the crank, where the pedals come out, lower than the axle line, because of a leverage factor. If it's above the axle line, you have no leverage. You're fighting against gravity. But if it's below the axle line, you actually have leverage because you triangulated the efficiency or the resistance to that bike. So all these things came into play. Ideally, the Nomura bike that I built ended up being what some people consider an artist's version of a bike. It was something that was very unique. It was an artisan's bike, and that's why.
Yeah. So it's interesting in your book, like kind of coming back to the landscaping. And the landscape, your background with landscaping was something, again, I'm not familiar with. Like, not that it's just way by Nomura. And so in your book, and I know we kind of talked about this a little bit, but in your book, you really talk fondly about your practice of landscaping, and you really have this like poetic sense of relating it to this artistry. The BMX, not so much. Like, there isn't that corollary to the BMX frame or to that sculpture. And so I think what is really beautiful about that is that you have this art discipline and this practice that's your profession, but then you also have these other tangential projects. But can you kind of, maybe not prioritize, but maybe explain your love of landscaping and like altering land and like, I guess, where that comes from?
I will tell you this, it's probably a misconception on your part, only because when I wrote the book, we wanted to highlight landscaping as a priority. It's my business, it's kind of my roots of that one. BMX was a small section of that, a segment of the book itself, only because we decided not a lot of people are going to be interested in my BMX career or an interest in, why I built the bike a certain way. So that's why we left it out. Ultimately, my plan was to actually write a second book exclusively on the Nomura bike. So I'm going to be working on that one. No promises on when or if it's going to get done, but that would be probably my next project. I would like to share a lot of the experiences for those of you that have been collectors and that appreciate my bike designs.
Yeah. So with just real quick, going back to landscaping, if I understand this correctly, your grandfather started a landscaping business that got passed down to your father, and then you have since inherited.
Correct.
That business. So this is like a 3-generation landscaping business.
Correct. That is correct.
Has it remained the same name? Has it always been the same name?
Yes, it has been. It's always been, I've been the principal, my father was the principal, and my grandfather was the principal. By the way, I vowed I would never be a landscaper. I hated gardening. My dad took me out when I was 9 years old. I was thinking, and this is, again, part of creating destiny, I hated it. And my father told me, he goes, you were the worst gardener I've ever seen. You were so lazy. So he goes, what you're going to do, he goes, you're going to go out working with the crew. And it was a Hispanic crew. And my foreman at the time, he was a college graduate, was on radio, he was a radio announcer. He took me under his wing and he says, I'm going to teach you Spanish. And he goes, the way I'm going to teach you Spanish, he goes, we don't speak any English when you're working with me. If you want something to eat, if you want a break, if you want a drink, you ask me, but you ask me in Spanish, or I'm going to ignore you. He says, so you better figure out how to say things, especially if you want to go to the bathroom, because I'm not going to stop either. You're going to just, it's going to keep going the way it's going to go. Well, I hated it because I would speak Spanish. 3 months, play baseball in the morning, and go work in the afternoon. Well, what happened was, when I started junior high school, I started beginner Spanish. In 8th grade, they made me skip 2 years. I went into advanced Spanish in my 8th grade year for beginner. I go, you guys made a mistake. I'm in the wrong class. I took the class, aced that one, and the teacher goes, you need to take one more test. I go, what's that? He goes, you need to test and see if you're bilingual. I go, I don't want to take another test. He goes, you don't get it. If you pass that test, your language requirement is done through high school and college. So I took the test and I tested bilingual. So big benefit there, along with now that I'm working. Exactly. It wasn't positive. But then the other thing that's been great is that now that I am bilingual, I'm able to work in a lot of Latin countries around the world, doing projects there, because of the fact that I can speak the language. Central America and South America are probably my most dominant areas that I go and travel to do humanitarian projects.
Yeah, it sounds like, from the book, there's a really interesting moment where it sounds like your discovery of BMX has this like intersection with landscaping, charity, and cycling. Can you explain maybe that seed or I guess that anecdote of those kids that were hassling you or that you had like taken under your wing?
I could, actually I should probably start, how I got into BMX. You probably want to hear this one. I was actually landscaping, doing a project, low-income housing area, right below City College. And at this project site, I got there, I awarded a contract from the city, and started doing work out there, and I had 5 kids that would come out every day. And this was during school time. And they would just hang out with me, ages 10 to 14 years old, and actually 13 years old. And every day there, I asked them, I go, why are you guys out here? Why are you guys hanging around? You're supposed to be in school. They go, we can't go back. We got kicked out. We're expelled. We're expelled for the whole year. So if this is what we do all day long, we just hang out in the projects. Well, I looked around, and it was pretty gangland. It was they were being influenced a lot by negative forces. So I took them in. I said, I'll tell you what, start working. If you work for me, I'll pay you some money. They started doing that, doing just little bitty jobs. One day I had my motorcycle on the back. You probably saw the picture there. And he goes, what are you going to do with that? Oh, I'm going to go practice. I'm a racer. I race motorcycles. He said, well, could we go with you? So I took them out, took them to the track. They loved it. I put them on the back of the bike, and I wouldn't do it nowadays, but we went through, did the jumps, we clearing doubles and all kinds of stuff. These kids hanging out. They had a helmet on. But at the end of it, they said, well, that was really cool. You know what? When we grow up, we want to be like you. We want to be a motorcycle racer. I go, you can't afford the bikes. I said, that's one thing. I said, but we could afford BMX bikes. So I literally went out there and priced it out to see what it would be like. And that's how I opened up Nomura Racing, because I could get wholesale bike parts for the kids in the project. That was how we ended up starting Nomura Racing. Shortly after that, we found out that there was a track, Stowe Park. A lot of you guys were talking about the track. So we went out to Stowe Park, and I signed them up in the beginner class. They loved it. They couldn't race. They were really slow. They barely knew how to ride bikes, but they got to race. So we did that. At one race, there was a Father's Day race. And they said, hey, wait, you got to go sign up. You're a father. So I went out, signed up, followed one of the bikes that I had given the kids, and ended up winning the Father's Day race. Well, one of the guys that I was racing against goes, he goes, I race nationals. He goes, and very seldom do I ever get beat. He goes, and you smoke me. There's a Grand National in Las Vegas at the end of the year. You might consider going there. So I went to Vegas, built a bike out of parts that I had at my bike shop. Went out there, ended up racing the Grand Nationals. There was a brand new class, 27 and over, and I won that race, making me the first, well, national champion. They gave me a national title.
How many 27-year-olds were racing?
There were total of, I think, 16 or 20.
Oh,
There were quite a few there, believe it or not. They're all old guys, and they were all guys that they were racing. This was one of the first few races I've been in.
That's kind of old for me.
It was extremely old. I'll tell you that right now. But I decided that if I could compete at the Grand National level and win, I may have potential to win this. So that's when I started designing the Nomura bike. I figured if I'm going to race out there, and I want to make sure that I have the best bike underneath me, and I couldn't find anything that was close, so that's why I built the bike. I built it so I could race it.
So,
But then I built enough so other people could also get the bike out there. So that was how the Nomura bike actually came about.
so these kids that were kind of hanging around and hassling you, were like getting into motorcycles, like thinking about BMX. I mean, how long did they hang around or were around when you started the business? And are you still in contact?
That is a good question. Once I started racing nationals, I gave up the local scene. Some of you may have even seen me racing Stoke Park in my early years, but I never went back there, only because I had to race nationals. I was gone most of the time. I was doing about, what was it? I figured out it was about 120,000 miles a year I was driving just to get to all the different tracks. I would literally cross the country a couple times to get to some of these tracks and race. And because of that, I was married at the time. Stayed married too. How that happened, I don't know. But the kids that I talked about, the kids from the projects, unfortunately I lost touch with them because I started taking all the national people with me. Anybody that signed up to race for me, I would take them with me. So national riders would be in the van with me, in the truck with me, motorhome would be just cruising. So I lost track of them. And probably 15 years after I retired from racing, the Japanese National Museum, the Japanese American National Museum, inducted me in to the Hall of Fame.
Is this the one in London?
In the one in Los Angeles, in an exhibit called More Than a Game. And they asked me one question. They said, what do you attribute your success to? And I started thinking about it, and I had to say, first, all these things came to my mind. 16 hours a day workout, driving, having the best bike, in my opinion, out there. But it actually hit me then, and I realized it was my family, my wife, my children, my parents, my brothers, my sisters, and my very close friends that actually sacrificed for me because they lived my dream. If they were not around, I couldn't race. I couldn't go out there. So they took care of my family and everything. Literally, I was by myself on it, out there. That's why I thought it was all me, but it wasn't. It was all about everybody else that I didn't even think about that were keeping me out there to race. So it was a big one. I looked at the kids at that time, and I said, well, I wonder what happened to those kids that I had, the 5 kids. Unfortunately, 2 of them committed suicide. One of them is in jail for life, felony offender. The other 2 I completely lost track of. So that was one of those other things that I realized, creating destiny, on occasion it does take its toll. But you can't watch everybody. You can't help everybody. Even though you try your best, that's all you can do.
Yeah. So I can imagine then that, Nomura Racing, I guess I was surprised to find out that when Nomura Racing started, it started as a shop, like as a retail shop, and then you crossed this threshold pretty early into that business to become a fabricator and to sell these things. Can you talk a little bit about that transition and to what degree this shop served as like a rallying point for people, students, racers, kids in the community?
It started out that way. It started as a hangout. When we opened up the bike shop, we were the only BMX shop out there. Max is pretty close to us, but they did all the bikes. We were exclusive. We were only BMX. That's all we sold, BMX products. And because of that, we had all the local hangouts there all the time. Well, when I started building and manufacturing the frames, I realized I would have to go out. But we still needed the shop to get parts and
Wholesale.
And money, wholesale. And to pay for me when I was out there racing. It was a rough life. So we kept the shop, I think, for almost 3 years. Yeah. But I did racing part for almost 5 years.
So to be clear, so the fabrication, at some point, the retail operation stopped and you just really focused on
We focused on 100% on fabrication. Yeah. The bike shop ended up, because I didn't have time in there. My sister was the one who actually running the shop, And unfortunately, we didn't make enough money, so she was making peanuts. So I said, you know what, it's not fair to you. Let's shut down the thing. We'll do mail order. You can get a real job, which you did do.
So when you were making these frames, and I guess I should say, and maybe update, just like a little like asterisk or like update to where these frames are today, and I think why I'm very interested in Wade's sculptures, frames occupying the space is because they're very highly sought after. And if you have a chance after the talk to go check out some of those frames that Wade has made in the back with some other elements from Nomura Racing.
There's some collectors out there too.
Yeah, we have the
Eric and the gang got some cool lights.
Thank you for bringing when you were making these at the time, they were sought after, and even more so now. So at that time when you were making these frames, what was that threshold that was crossed, I think, for you, whether it be through titles or whether it be through like craftsmanship, that really solidified Nomura Racing as this like BMX hallmark that like made a requirement of people to seek these things out?
When I first
Because they
started,
were more expensive, right?
they were way more expensive. Yeah, that was the hardest part of the sale. Most of the bikes at that time, frames were going for under $100. My bike cost me to manufacture $175. So you can imagine what that was. So I had to sell them for close to $300, which I couldn't do. But
And we're just talking about the frame.
we're talking just the frame.
No parts.
No parts or anything like that. Basically, it was, I built the bike and I didn't want to take any shortcuts. I looked at the bikes that were out there. They were made out of steel. Chromoly became one of the new types of materials. They were just coming to the threshold of using titanium and aluminum. So I looked at titanium actually as my first choice. And I looked at the characteristics of it, and I found out that titanium is very springy. And so you have feedback in it. It doesn't give you enough resistance. Whereas aluminum, you can get thicker body, thicker parts. Build those up, have less flex, and it actually absorbs the track vibration, making it a lot faster. And that's why I decided to go with aluminum rather than the titanium. Also, titanium had a tendency back then to crack pretty easy because the more you work it, the more cracks you start getting in it. So I went with the aluminum, first of all. And then the next one, just to give you a little history on it, that down tube, the big down tube that I got, that actually came, we found that tube, it was by Alcoa. It was used for a space shuttle project that was scrapped. And so we found that tube, we go, that's exactly what I was looking for. Something we didn't want to have to flatten out, it actually came extruded, so it was formed that way. So we had the strength and integrity of that one. And we put it together, that made the Nomura bike. And it's definitely something that catches your eye, you see that is very unique. And so that's actually where it came from. By the way, Channing's out there. The first bike that I had welded, his father did it himself. So.
Would you say in your mind that the hallmark of a Nomura frame is really centered around that down tube? Like every time you look at one of your frames, are you constantly gravitated towards that element?
Most people see that as the first eye-catching part. Of course, it's the part that stands out the most. But
Just to be clear, when we talk about the down tube of a bicycle frame, we're talking about like basically where the logo lives. So on this Huffy, where you see the big bold Huffy letters, that's the tube.
that would be the down.
That one tube, I think. Yeah.
Exactly. Actually, it's for me, it was a little bit of everything because I took every part of that frame and I changed it up to try and make it better. So the down tube was just a small component of it. The other parts were the headset, for example. We made it, the slope of the backbone, the down tube, was something else that we looked at because we didn't want to go parallel. I thought that was just goofy looking. Didn't want to live with that one. And it actually added weight to the bike and design. And it got in the way of riding. So that's why it has a slope down tube on the back. The back triangle actually, where the rear wheel sits in his house, actually was all bent with a mandrel. Tim Rocklizer from True Radius Bending did all those bends by hand. Each of those, when I say done by mandrel, they actually...
They're still in business. True Radius Bending?
I don't think so. No, yeah. Brian's working now with that out there in precision welding. But actually what a mandrel is, a tube that's being bent on a machine, hydraulically bent. A mandrel actually goes in and puts a piece inside that bend, and so the wall inside and outside stays the same. You don't stretch the outside and compress the inside. This holds it more consistent. So those are all done individually. Each weld was done by hand that way. You'll see the rear dropouts, or where the rear wheel actually is housed. The unique part of all my designs is that I actually encased the rear axle. And the reason I did that, that was one of the old weak links. Most of them were just plated. And so you had an axle going through a plate that could potentially flex. I actually put wings on it and made it a frame, like an I-beam frame, where that would then keep that part from flexing. So every part of the bike I took a look at to try to strengthen up, to eliminate any flex in a bike.
Yeah. And really stiffen it.
Stiffened it up, yeah.
But that also, due to the aluminum and the stiffness and the degree of which you're riding these bikes, also caused them to have somewhat short lifespans.
Correct, that is correct.
Yeah. Which is also related to why these things are, also highly sought after today, because not many survive
Right.
Race day.
We had what was considered one of the stiffest bikes at that time. There's very few, actually, there's no other bike that was tested stiffer than the Nomura. So that definitely helped out the straightaway speed. One of those pictures just shows me coming off a starting line, and it's going to take a while before I cycle through. But if you watch me, I'm standing up and pulling out of the gate, and if you look at me, the front tire is slightly off the ground, but you'll see the chain. And that chain, I was running small sprockets for weight and leverage. That chain actually has a bow in it about 3 inches. And that was basically all flex from the chain and from the frame itself. So that's how much load we put on a bike every single time we go out. Some of you have single speeds or race BMX. I was having to change, we used to use Sun Tours because they had the best flanges and the best dogs in it, so they wouldn't strip out as much. But I was having to change those things every 6 months because we were literally blowing apart the housings, the case hardened housings on those free wheels every 6 months. So we couldn't afford it. So we were taking those along with the change. Literally on a BMX bike, we were stretching change too.
Yeah.
So it's kind of unique.
And just to be clear about why I think this idea of stiffness is sought after within cycling is because when you, as a rider, you're powering this machine, the food you eat that you turn into energy, that goes to your legs to pedal the bicycle, that's all caloric energies being expelled to propel your bike forward. And every time your bicycle flexes or a component flexes, all that caloric energy is just lost into, it's just wasted, and it's not translated to the wheels and then translated to the ground. So, yeah.
True. Well, another thing, this is not a brag, but this is part of the workout exercise regimens we did. We would literally work out 16 hours a day. That was my daily regimen. Part of it included a sitting on a stationary bicycle and spinning, while I could put my RPMs up. Because if you could turn your legs faster, you could run a lower gear. Using the lower gear means you can get off the line faster with more speed. At that time, I was able to spin at 220 RPM. Not consistently, but I would hit that number on occasion. Very few people, even on track rate, would do that back then.
You sound serious.
That was serious. That was 220. Actually, 221 was
I want to talk a little bit about Nomura's branding and how you came up with those logos, especially because there is a pretty extensive history of Japanese cycling imports coming into the United States. And I'm curious how you got your branding, came up with your branding, and if that was ever mixed up within those imports, if there was ever any confusion with that, and kind of how you did it.
Good question. Believe it or not, we never were mixed up with the Japanese manufacturers. Everybody knew we were from Santa Barbara. Literally, Santa Barbara had a big name even in BMX, so we were able to market it that way. If you look at the logos, I tried to go with Japanese heritage. I wanted to show that there's quality involved with it, that I had personal input in it. So you'll see on the helmet, that's one, by the way, that has to show the chain being flexed out. I don't know if you can see that or not. But the helmet design, I have a rising sun on top, not the 13, but I put 5 up there. And the reason I did 5, if you look at my helmet back there, is because I didn't want to have to paint 5. So I literally cut those out. So I just did 5 instead of 7. I was going to go with 7, I did that one. The colors were white. That was my dominant color because I thought white was the good guy. I always wanted to do white. If you look at the era back then, everybody was using dark colors. So we stood out like crazy being white. So you can see us anywhere on the track, and we look like the good guys. The colors that ranged from there went to yellow to orange to red. We did that to kind of replicate the sun. So So because of that, that's where the colors all kind of came from. BMX, the design of the clothes was an important part of our branding, so we wanted to make sure we were set up. We were offered quite a few other manufacturers or people that were doing clothing for us, but we stuck with JT because at that time they were the premier ones. Everybody wanted to be sponsored by JT, so we were lucky we picked that one up, and we hung on to them for as long as we could. So that's where you see most of it. The logos and everything else itself was all part of literally the branding process. Our frames, our jerseys, everything we had, if it was a quote factory bike or sticker on it, it was highly sought after. And we were trying to get away from those people that said they were factory riders that were buy-your-owns. They would buy our equipment, they would buy our bikes, they would buy our jerseys and pants, but we would not sell them the factory part because they were trying to push themselves off oftentimes as factory riders. And next thing you know, it kind of diluted our efforts. We want to always stay consistent at the top. Oh, by the way, our cruiser bike, this is something interesting. I don't think many of you realize that. That's the larger frame, the big wheel bike, 26-inch. The first year I put that out, we built, I think, 14 or 15 of those bikes, the 26-inch cruisers. The first year we raced that on tour was with the NBA, National Bicycle Association. They had 6 classes, age group classes, in the cruiser class. And we were the only ones ever in history to sweep all 6 classes the first year out with that frame. So we won literally every race, every national on that bike. So I don't think anybody will ever be able to do that again. It's going to cost a lot of money for those racers. We were lucky to get a frame. The bike that I built, that I was racing before I built my bike, weighed right at 28 and a half pounds. My first Nomura bike that I put on the track was 19 3/4 pounds. So it was a huge difference, and I think that's where a lot of speed came from.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's remarkable for the time. And so, speeding up to 2022, there is a horde, or seemingly my perception, there's a horde of people who are like doggedly trying to find and locate and or account for the existence of some of these artifacts, these frames. 26-inch, 20-inch, and very few 24-inch.
Very few. I did 9 24-inch bikes.
Yeah. So two questions. How do you explain this kind of like cult-like following that has come about looking for your frames or looking for your products or your creations? But then also, would you feel comfortable sharing an anecdote about someone offering you, what has someone has offered you for your personal collection? Or
it happened right when I first retired. I was getting into
as soon as I announced this on Facebook and the Nomura Facebook group, two people immediately reached out and like, "Those Wade movies something."
Yeah, that is a good question.
We're gonna sell books.
When I retired from racing, it was due to injuries. I had some major injuries. I ended up with, by the way, 22 broken bones in my career of racing. So the last one took me out, and I thought I could come back. And I crashed in Vegas off a 16-foot jump, literally. 16 foot. I landed on my shoulder, broke my collarbone, my shoulder blade, broke 2 ribs, and punctured my lungs. And they sent me to the hospital, believe it or not. A week later, after I got out of the hospital, I jumped on my bike because I didn't want to lose time for training. I ended up crashing and broke my same collarbone, landed on the same shoulder again. So I go, well, that was kind of stupid. I'm going to give it some time to heal. So 3 weeks later, I jumped on a track at Azusa. Went out there and raced. I go, I'm going to race an amateur class, not a pro class. So I jumped on the amateur class. It was a pretty good group. There were a lot of fast experts out there, one pro. Ended up pulling the whole shot and crashing the first turn on the same shoulder again, broke it. So I broke it 3 times in 1 month. So I go, well, you know what? This isn't as fun as it used to be. I retired because of that one. And some people ask me, have I ever gone back or thought about it? I literally, at that point, vowed that I would never go back because I still had the bug. I still knew I could be competitive. Even to this day, I know I can still be competitive because they're moving up the age groups. But I won't go back because I'm not willing to put back my entire life to become a racer again. And that literally is what it does.
Yeah. So these things, yeah.
You asked me about my other bike too.
If people have hustled you.
Some people have hustled me. I think people hustle me. I try not to let it happen. The gold bike that you see up there standing alone is the last of my bikes. That was the last national bike I raced. It was a 24-inch bike. I'm going to keep that one forever. I was offered $50,000 from a collector for that bike.
In the United States, or?
Yeah, it actually US United States, that bike right there. And people, it looks like a normal bike, but it has everything from Campanella record hubs with titanium axles, titanium races. It has a whole bunch of stuff in there, so we put the whole thing together to try and keep it competitive. Again, I always wanted to know when I was on the line that not only did I earn it because I was working out harder than anybody on both sides of me on starting game, but also my bike was superior. Having that in your head gives you definitely an edge, and that was part of why I feel I was successful. When I turned pro, I was the oldest person to turn pro back then, at the ripe age of 30 years old, and I was competing against 18-year-olds. I had won 85% of my races as an amateur in my age group, so I figured I completed that cycle, and everybody expected me to win. People would bet when I was going to lose, so I go, why am I racing? They're betting against me to lose. So I went to pros, figuring that would be an easier way to go, and those kids were fast. I hung with those kids. My best rankings as a pro was number 12 in the world in cruiser class, but that was only because I was racing a lot, not because I was winning a lot of money. There were some good races right now.
Yeah. So you're making your BMX career ends, and we're looking at a time frame from roughly 1979 to 1983. Is that correct? After 83, to what degree did you stay involved with cycling casually, or was cycling purely this other experience, this other interaction?
I completely gave up BMX. I would ride my BMX bike. I switched over to mountain bikes. I was offered 2 jobs with 2 different bicycle manufacturers to build a mountain and design a mountain bike for them. The very first bike that came down the Kamikaze in Mammoth Mountain that was suspended was one that I designed, and that was the first one to break the 5-minute barrier. That was the year that Wayne Croasdale won. So I don't know if some of you heard in St. Wayne Croasdale, he resisted me. He said there's no way he's going to put a suspended bike on a hill until he showed him that on the clock it was a lot faster. Yeah. So that was the first bike. So I did help out with that KHS.
I have just a couple more questions for you, and then we'll take questions from the audience if anyone has any. In chapter 5 of your book, Open Your Eyes, you speak a little bit to some of the prejudices that you've encountered, whether it be in the BMX community or just locally. And I'm curious, how that, I was like really interested reading this, those anecdotes, but then also understanding that this book reads as this like really long format, almost like resume of sorts of just like accomplishment and just like really this kind of input that you've created just from this grit and determination. Oftentimes within the Asian diaspora, within the United States, there's a really complicated trope, which is the model minority. And I'm just curious if you have any sort of like reflection about that, or any sort of proximity to that idea or to that expression. And it feels pretty salient today. I mean, there's a Supreme Court case that has, I think that's been debated about Harvard admission Asian students at Harvard, and that really kind of gets to the heart of that idea. So I'm just curious about your perspective.
That has happened I'd say fairly recent years. Even up to when my kids were going to school, we took a look at UC Irvine, and at that time, they were accepting minorities, anything but Asians. So you still see that happening today. You talk about the model minority. That was one thing that I didn't want to get caught in. In other words, when I say that, I knew that I always wanted to accomplish. I wanted to achieve it. I wanted to do the best I could possibly do. But I fit perfectly within that model minority mode. People see me as, quote, a success because I'm a minority. Well, that wasn't the case. I was doing it for myself. And being a minority, it's an interesting kind of concept because you brought up in a society that's predominantly white. And I was only one of 4 minorities in my grammar school in the Mesa, Monroe. So it was kind of strange. But in looking at that and being a minority, you always think you fit in. If you're an athlete, if you got your buddies out there, you're playing sports, you always fit in. But then you realize that when you get home, you look in the mirror, you don't look the same as everybody else. And because of that, it actually drove me. I wanted to make sure I was better, because people have always looked at me as inferior. And by the way, I was a short, fat kid when I was younger. Terrible athlete. When I went from 6th grade to 7th grade, I literally grew 6 inches over that summer, and went from the little short, fat kid to the superstar. I was a superstar. I was the #1 pick on every sport, from baseball, basketball, football, only because I was still a monster at 5'7". but that was as a 7th grader. So because of that, I did see the benefits of working hard and achieving that. I do see that on occasion people will call you the model minority, but that's because people are literally focusing on minorities. You're not focusing as a society. I think the hardest part of it is that if you look around this room, we're a planet. Most places, that's what we see. And the benefit of that is there's no majorities or no minorities. Everything fits in one and the same. That's something people have to start understanding and realizing. We fight against prejudice all the time, but part of fighting the prejudice creates more prejudice. I've seen this happen. I do speaking on DEI in different areas because of my being a mayor and working with different groups. But I will tell you this, when people can start respecting people because of who they are, that's when you're going to have a balance. You always have to look at them for what they individually accomplish. The individual is unique, each and every one of us. Anyone in the world, you never find a twin of yourself. Somebody may be close, but that uniqueness is something that everybody else should also cherish, the uniqueness of each individual.
Yeah, thank you. Switching gears just a little bit, this is kind of like maybe another dense question, but I'm not from Santa Barbara. I've been here now for like 8 years, and I've been a practicing artist for the entire time I've been here, and it's been really difficult to find space and find this kind of collectivization around other makers in town because of this depreciation of actual places to make things. And so I'm curious, seeing as like you starting as a maker and a fabricator and coming all the way up and ascending to the political echelons of Carpinteria, what is your perspective or anecdote for people like myself and people in the audience who are makers for finding things, finding places to make, or finding solutions to make things in a place that is so seemingly like economically prohibitive and just impossible at times?
For the BMX bikes, the Nomura bikes that I built, most of those parts were actually subbed out. Timmy did the bending for me. We had different people doing welding. Dave Yokes had ultimately ended up doing all of our welds for us, so that was done in his shop, so we were able to do that. The machine work, I did most of the machine work myself. Believe it or not, those anodized strands you see in the back, all of them have to be hand polished. They have to look like a mirror, literally, hand polished to make sure that that shows through, because anodizing is somewhat transparent. You see any blends inside on that metal. So I probably polished 250 BMX bike frames. And I swear I was choking out black powder for days. But that's what it takes to do it. But you can do it. It just having different areas, different venues, having one place where you're going to do welding, one place you're going to do polishing, one group that's going to be doing the heat treating. So you farm everything out. We were fairly successful, I would say, in the early 80s, late 90s, in Santa Barbara with bicycle manufacturers. And if you look in history books, you'll find quite a few manufacturers that came out of the Santa Barbara area. The benefit of that is that they were collective. They went together and they talked about what they were doing. Each of them had a specialty that they were going to do. None of us replicated that work. Because of that, it became a hotbed. And it was easy to find, I would suggest co-op, something like that. If you had a building this size, you could house 4 or 5 different fabricators in an area like this. That would cut the cost down tremendously. But again, it pushes you to get better when you see somebody else working right next to you doing something that's amazing.
Yeah.
So That's what bumps it all up. And you'll find this worldwide. Some area that has something that is really good and they're very good at, you will see then 2 or 3 other smaller companies right behind them doing the same quality or better in that same area or region. I think that's going to be the trick. That's going to be the secret. If Santa Barbara wants to become a hotbed, you got to collectively work together to find us.
Yeah, I agree. Last couple questions. What is the future of Nomura Racing?
That's a good question. When I retired in '84, I thought I would never go back to the sport, and I meant it, and that included manufacturing. It was a tough time, tough life. I was definitely not making a lot of money on the track, nor was I making a lot of money selling the bikes, only because we were way ahead of our time. Back then, you could buy a complete racing bike, competitive racing bike, for about $300. If you bought a Nomura bike, you're going to pay $350 for a frame and fork set. So, yeah, it was a tough sale, and that made it a little bit rough. However, recent times, I've got a lot of people ask me that, you know, if I have, I would say, a desire to come back again. I've been thinking about that. There is a possibility of that. One thing I will tell you, if I do come back with it, I'm not going to build a bike that's going to be different. I'm not going to try and compete with my original bike. What I want to do is build a bike where somebody can buy a bike, a Nomura bike, and ride it with the exact same feel as the original bike. It's not going to be different. It's going to be the same, because people should experience what a racing bike felt like back in the 70s and 80s. That's what it's all about. Anybody can buy a new modern day bike. They're all going to be great. They'll all be different. However, going back in time and seeing what it was like to race one of the best bikes, in my opinion, out there, is something that nobody's going to have that opportunity to do. Very few, except for you guys said that got my collection. But that's a unique opportunity. Most people never see that and feel it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because I think so much about modern bikes and the comfort of modern bikes and the efficiency of modern bikes is predicated on the work that people like yourself did and the data-driven approach that you brought to your practice and to your art that has now become commonplace. And so to potentially take people back to this era of that feeling is like really interesting. And it certainly seems like the right time in the market to do something like that as well.
We're looking at cruise bikes. We've got a couple of people in here right now considering that, but we'll probably be looking at that. That's something to do.
Cool.
20 inches we thought about, but the crowd that will probably be buying it will be the adult crowd.
Yeah.
There's not too many 20-inch adults out there.
We the kids ripping, just causing trouble on State Street, you know, on the PK Rippers. They're not riding 20-inch bikes. They're all 29-inch
29-inch
3-inch plus tires. Yeah.
And Scott and I were actually friends. We're good friends. We were competing against each other because both of us were in the same age group.
Yeah.
Both of us turned pro. He was pro before me, but then I jumped into pros with him too. But his bikes, he ended up selling out. And, the new bike that you see out there now is a good testament to his success.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. My last question for you is there any other projects or efforts or endeavors that you would like to promote or tell the audience about?
Actually, not really. I'm kind of enjoying life right now, fortunately. The unfortunate part, I'm still working. I still have my business. I've got 24 employees. I still run my landscaping business. Try to run a city when I can. And then Rotary I do about 40 hours a week volunteer time, so that probably takes up most of my time. Including this time of the season, it's junior golf time, so I'm also the director for junior golf in the Santa Barbara area. So we do that twice a week. So it doesn't leave me a lot of time. So I will tell you maybe later on when I get to slow down a little bit, we'll see what else is out there. But again, I'm enjoying life. Part of that co-creating destiny is giving me a lot of opportunities to meet a lot of great people. I think that's what I enjoy most, is the networking, the friendships that occur from every different facet. If you look at this room, I mean, back when I was a BMXer, we couldn't sit with anybody else. BMXers were rebels. And if you sat in a group like this, we would be in the back of the room, probably getting laughed out of here or getting chased out, one of the two. So with the blend now that we've got, it's amazing. I've enjoyed that. We have BMXers now with successful business people, and it's something that I never thought I would see.
Yeah.
It's great.
It is cool.
Yeah. again, like I said, who would have thought I'd be a mayor too?
Well, that's really, I think, it for me and Wade. So if anyone has any questions.
Well, I wanted to say that we have a reception following this, and we're sort of over time, so I encourage you all to stay. We're so grateful to you. I feel like we could have sat here for another hour to listen to your amazing history, and thank you, Adam. This was a wonderful talk, and yeah, please stick around, and thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you all.
All right, thank you. If anybody wants to talk to me,
Yeah,
there's a lot of opportunities I realize that.
there's bicycle blended cocktails. Take it, I don't have a drink.
Thanks.
Thank you.